Hi, I'm Karen Evans-Reeves. I'm an Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Bath's Tobacco Control Research Group, and today I'd like to talk to you about being intimidated for trying to improve health. So I'd like to talk to you about a piece of research that we published back in November of last year, 2024. It's featured in Health Promotion International Journal in its special edition on the commercial determinants of health. The research is a scoping review about the intimidation researchers and advocates experience in the course of their tobacco, alcohol and ultra-processed food work. Today I'll be picking out the alcohol results for you. If you'd like to read the full paper, it is open access from Health Promotion International. There is also a shorter piece on the key findings in the Conversation academic magazine. So onto the methods very briefly. We searched the peer-reviewed literature for instances of intimidation. We also did a supplemental grey literature search to make sure that we weren't missing anything that hadn't been captured in the peer-reviewed literature. In the end, we had 64 sources, so not just academic papers, although those were the majority, but there were also blogs, news articles, a book, a webinar, which all contained instances of intimidation. I have to say that only a small percentage of these sources discussed intimidation by those working in the alcohol sector. We did have 6 papers describing instances of intimidation. For all of the intimidations, we mapped them onto a pre-existing framework of intimidation types that was developed by my colleague Britta Mathis. This resulted in 10 different types of intimidation, or categories of intimidation if you like. The numbers represent the number of papers or sources, as we call them, which contain this type of intimidation. Each circle represents a separate source, so a paper, blog, or a news article, for example, and the more circles, the more sources that contain that form of intimidation. So the final number actually adds up to more than the number of sources we had overall, so we have 64 sources. But several sources included more than one type of intimidation, so that's why the numbers look larger. You can kind of consider this a continuum of intimidation, with what we deem to be the least severe forms of intimidation on the left, working all the way up to the most severe forms of intimidation on the right-hand side. So as we viewed it, although it may be distressing to be discredited, it's arguably less impactful than physical violence threats. In the sources that detail intimidation of those working in the alcohol regulatory space, 3 types of intimidation come up. So the first was public discreditation. The second was complaints to individuals and employers. And the third were freedom of information requests. And I'm going to talk about those in a bit more detail now to provide you some flavour of what was going on. Public discreditation occurred in the alcohol space in 4 different countries in the literature included in our scoping review. So they happened in Australia, South Africa, New Zealand and Malawi. In Australia, instances of intimidation were mentioned in 2 separate sources. The first talked about the behaviour of a corporation which publicly denigrated scientists' independent research when the corporation received pushback after trying to open a large alcohol outlet in the country. In the second incident and second source, industry third parties wrote to a government committee on fetal alcohol syndrome, referring to alcohol policy researchers and advocates as the anti-alcohol lobby, and labelled them as extremists and argued that advocates were essentially paid government advisors. These are really common industry tactics where companies present flawed arguments that resonate, and they argue that governments essentially pay to lobby themselves. In South Africa, a proposed bill on alcohol marketing restrictions was opposed by the industry. This opposition included attempts to intimidate, discredit and demobilise actors in favour of the bill. Industry third parties also discredited experts by placing ads in major newspapers attacking their credibility, their research and the motives of the research funders as well. In New Zealand, an industry-paid consultant repeatedly denigrated 3 different public health researchers, 1 obesity researcher, 1 tobacco control expert, and 1 professor of addiction who supported alcohol regulation. Defamatory blog posts included the following defamatory statements. So if there was ever a case of demonstrating once and for all that Professor Doug Selman is mad, this article, Drunk Steel Sanitizer for Alcohol, proves it. Any ounce of credibility that this guy had has long since evaporated. Maybe it's time Doug has a quiet beer under a tree and learns to calm the F down. And then there's a second one, and there were many more examples of this. These are just a couple we picked out. So what a complete something smoker. Who the F signs off on the funding for this troffer? Troffer is another word for sort of someone who is money hungry. The consultant who wrote these things was paid by the New Zealand Food and Grocery Council, which works for alcohol and food companies. The consultant later admitted that the comments that he'd made in the blog posts were defamatory and insulting and unfair. And I'll come on to this a little bit more in a few slides' time as well about what happened afterwards. In Malawi, advocates were attempting to create space for alcohol control policies, but alcohol industry representatives attended policy meetings and undermined scientists' research and presented alternative facts as well, making it very difficult for the advocates in Malawi. In South Africa, complaints were made to an individual and to an employer. It's not clear if it's the same individual in question or not. However, the first example at the top there states that the alcohol industry representatives and a lawyer met with an employer to complain about quotes that an employee who supported alcohol regulations had made in the press. Obviously, the presence of the lawyer there makes it a little bit more threatening as well. The second example is about a personal and belligerent letter written by a board member of a major South African alcohol company to a public health academic who supported the draft bill on alcohol marketing restrictions. In New Zealand, the industry consultant that I've mentioned repeatedly submitted Freedom of Information requests to gather information that he would then use in defamatory blog posts. Responding to Freedom of Information requests is a time-consuming business and can be really convoluted, especially if the institution is not well versed on vexatious requests. In our scoping review, our data analysis occurred in 2021. Papers have since been published on intimidation, including a paper by Gemma Mitchell and Jane McKimbridge in 2022. Their qualitative study with academics conducting research into alcohol found also that they had been subjected to public discreditation, complaints to individuals and employers, but also additional types of intimidation too that can be mapped onto this framework, including complaints to funders about their work, legal threats and action, and the most discussed was surveillance. Primarily, this was about where the alcohol industry would be present at academic conferences and other events, but it wasn't just the research under scrutiny, but also the researchers as well. And often these attendances would lead on to further communications and feelings of intimidation by the researchers. Therefore, this paper kind of extends the research further to show that the alcohol industry uses the same tactics as tobacco and ultra-processed food industries. Intimidation across the different sectors in our scoping review had a chilling effect on the work of advocates and researchers, and therefore also the passage and implementation of policy. Responding to intimidation reduces resources available for the work, whilst those targeted responded or raised a defence. In many cases, progress with regulations is achieved and was achieved in these cases, albeit significantly delayed. And on a personal level, being intimidated can significantly impact on our well-being, and that's particularly the case if there's not enough support, either within your family or within your institution. Also looked at how individuals responded to intimidation. So where that information was available in the literature, we categorized how they responded. In very few cases, individuals actually withdrew from their activities altogether because of the intimidation, but this was a minority of cases. Others reported carrying on as usual with their work and making no changes at all. Others reported defensive actions, such as increasing security measures or amending their research activities to protect themselves. And finally, the most commonly reported activity was offensive action, where those intimidated took action to correct misinformation presented about them, or launched legal action of their own. For example, the defamed researchers in New Zealand sued the industry consultant and won. And then other instances of more severe intimidation, some researchers and advocates reported incidents to the police. So in summary then, the alcohol industry uses the same tactics as other industries do to intimidate those who are producing work that is not in their favour. More research is needed to see if some of the other tactics we identified have also been used against those working in alcohol research and advocacy. Whilst responding directly to intimidation may not be desirable, outing the intimidation as a tactic may go some way to minimising its likely impact both on the work and the individuals targeted. We do actually have a help sheet that's accessible via this QR code with advice on how to protect yourself from intimidation in the course of your work. The key recommendations that we have in there refer to tobacco control advocates, but are definitely transferable to those working in alcohol control also. Thank you very much.